Well, welcome to Silver Lining for Learning, episode 56. And we have a guest today who's been on my mind all 56 episodes, and we luckily snuck him in here today on a lovely day. And so I hope that we can have an enlightening conversation amongst us. Oh, it's not lovely in Boston, but in Bloomington, it's very lovely. You know, the world has become increasingly open for learning. Some will contend that as well, but one of the main participants of all that is our guest today, because he's been involved in open courseware that you might have heard about with MIT in 2001. He's been involved in the open educational resources movement as well. And before that, learning objects. And after that, open textbooks. And during it all, the Open Learning Conference that he ran for 16 years till it got up to 800 or so people. And then he decided, well, somebody else might want to run this for a couple of years and get it to 1,000. But David's been a teacher in a community college setting, as well as in tenure track settings at Utah State and Brigham Young University, where he's an associate professor. And now at Lumen Learning, chief academic officer. And maybe he'll want to talk a bit about Lumen and what it does and what it's going to do. He's a Simon Fellow at Carnegie Mellon, also a fellow at Creative Commons, and was in Fast Company's top 100 most creative people in business in 2009. How does one become the most creative person in business when you're a tenured professor in education? You'll have to tell us about that. Kind of interested in that story. But maybe, David, we need to go back to the starting point. Tell us, you've dabbled in so many areas. There's no way we're going to cover all of that. But maybe in your introduction, you can provide a bit of these different phases that you've been in and what got you in. What was the initial entry point? I think I remember a keynote once we were talking about calculators or something on the web that you can look up. I forget exactly the metaphor that you were using or the example you were using, but can you provide us with a sense of your journey that got you to this point?
Yeah, well, thanks for that intro, by the way. Maybe I'll take 2 minutes and try to tell this calculator story briefly. It is a really seminal kind of, my professional career rotated around this moment. In the mid 90s, I was running a small internet company here in West Virginia and was hired away from that to become the very first webmaster at Marshall University, where I was working on my undergraduate degree in music. And I was simultaneously staff there, the first webmaster they had hired. And I sat in a pretty small kind of closet kind of space with a big heater sticking up, radiator style heater in there, just kind of tucked in the back working. And I was, this would have been 97, maybe. I was writing a calculator in JavaScript, and I had this kind of epiphany in this way that like the clouds part and a ray of sunshine kind of comes down and lands on you. And it wasn't that I learned something that no one had ever known before. Lots of people had discovered what I was about to discover. But I understood in that moment that as I was making that JavaScript calculator, that once I finished that and put it on our website, that 1 million people could all use that calculator at the same time. And that was really importantly different from the calculators that we kind of took turns using at my elementary school, where you kind of did your thumbs and waited your turn for the calculator to come around. There is something really different about digital resources than physical resources. And that kind of curiosity or interest or moment of enlightenment about the power of digital compared to physical when it came to things that we use to support learning set me on this track that, as you mentioned, ran through learning objects, ran through open courseware, ran through open textbooks, through open educational resources, to where I am now at Lumen. Through all of that, I've always been interested in this idea of this kind of magical property, what we would describe, what economists describe as being non-rivalrous, which is a word that already existed that I just never heard of before. But this magical property of things that are digital and our ability to share them with each other in a way that we'd never been able to share before, that kind of lit up got the neurons firing in my brain, sitting in that little closet at Marshall in '97, probably. That's what started it all for me.
Well, you know that we wrote an article together in last year, and I have a story that starts out in 1999 and how I hated you in 1999. Because right. I walked into the room showing my students the syllabus for my emerging learning technologies class, and they looked at it, and a couple of them, not all of them, a couple raised their hands and said, "Where are learning objects? There's this guy named David Wiley who's got a new book, I think, with EdTech magazine people. You know, I think he had a free book out there somewhere in the ether, but you had these learning object papers, and don't you have a week on learning, at least a week?" And I remember a Korean student going, "In Korea, it's a hot topic." And then we had a Silicon Valley guy just moved to IU. "It's a big topic in the Silicon Valley." I'm like, I don't know anything about learning objects. I'm going to have to revise my whole syllabus. So anyways, David and I wrote an open access article this year with a couple of stories, and we'll get to your story here in a little bit, but Punya wants to jump in here. So Punya.
Yeah, I just had that moment of epiphany you speak of, David. I mean, I remember two. I mean, one is, I had my undergrad in engineering and went to design school. And it was the first time I worked with a Mac, and it was HyperCard. Because before then, you'd have to write these pages of code. And then the fact that you could write little snippets of code and I remember creating this simulation for electromagnetism where I could create these animations and stuff. And that was one moment. But the really more interesting moment was the first time I started WordStar on my Mac and had this first static HTML page. And I was in a computer lab all by myself. I go over to another computer and I log into the IP address, and that page that I've created shows up. I go back to this machine, make one change and save, come back. And the fact that it hit, I remember that moment so clearly because it was anybody in the world who had that number.
Yeah.
Could now see this. And you could feel the earth shift. Now, I'm not predicting Facebook and fake news and misinformation and all the other awesome things that have also happened because of the internet. But I remember that. So that what you described is very palpable.
Yeah, that sense of possibility.
Yes. So thank you for that. I mean, I don't really have a question. I just, what you said just sort of resonated so powerfully. I was like, oh, that's exactly. I mean, when I was doing my master's in design, EdTech was not on my radar. I wanted to make educational film, and that was the transition, was HyperCard moving me there. And then of course the web and all of that. So thank you for sharing that, because it brought back some nice memories myself.
Yeah, no, I was on my way to being a high school music teacher. That was my dream. That's what I was preparing for. And it's a long story, but I just kind of fell in love with the web, and nobody in West Virginia was really doing anything with the internet in the mid 90s. And there was space to start a company and start training people and start doing stuff. And it was super heady and really fun and really exciting. And then I got hired by the university, and then I realized, wait, you could use this to support education, and just connection after connection after connection happening. And there's a whole string of stories. They're just somewhere between serendipity and providence, that I could tell about those early days that kind of got me pointed in a direction before I kind of shot out of the barrel,
Cool. I left West Virginia in '92. I should have hung around there. It'd been kind of fun collaborating with you in the mid '90s. A lot of fun. Did you get hired by MIT to help with the OpenCourseware movement? Did those people read your work on learning objects, or how did you get connected to those folks?
Wow. Yeah. Well, there's another story. I'll tell you how I got connected with them. There was a meeting. It was a joint meeting between NSF and ONR in, I can't remember, 2001, 2002. Now, I'd started my work on Open in 1998, but as far as I knew, the people at MIT, I don't know if they'd ever seen it, read it. I was blogging and publishing about it, but it was hard to tell who was reading what back then. But my real connection to the folks at MIT came through the Hewlett Foundation. And maybe I'll not tell that story now and just say that when I became a Hewlett grantee, Hewlett was also funding MIT OpenCourseware, and they kind of put us together. The first work that we did then was we were building at Utah State, we were building a platform to try to help all the people who are coming to MIT OpenCourseware to use it as informal learners be able to find and connect with each other, to ask and answer questions of one another, to provide some social interaction and some support and community around MIT OpenCourseware, because that was not ever something that they, seemed to be interested in doing.
Can
So
you also
if I
go
can
ahead?
ask a follow-up, I want to ask a question about something you just said, David. Like the first time when you were programming that calculator and that sense of possibility.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, because this is something I think about, quite a bit, is how much this internet has transformed over time. When I look back to 98, 99, 2000, this sense of possibility there was this, when blogging first started, that people were sharing ideas, and now you see a lot of sort of the corporate sort of influence in that. You see the way data is being used, you see the way those sort of information bubbles are. So I wonder, how you are thinking, because I am in a very mixed space on that right now, honestly, with the sort of because I still believe in the potential of a lot of positive change, but I also see the risks and the downsides are also as stark. So I wonder how you reflect on that transition, having started around sort of the same 98, 99, and to now. I mean, when I was a grad student in Illinois, I worked at NCSA. And so that's the team that built Mosaic and all of that. Yeah. So, so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about this, because to me, that's a huge shift, particularly with respect to education, because it's clear that the needs and the roles of educators now have need to shift, significantly because of a lot of these factors. So just wondering about what your thoughts are on that arc.
Yeah, I would say, if you haven't read The Master Switch by Tim Wu, my thinking on this topic is significantly influenced, by his work there, where he, goes back and kind of looks at the history of information technologies and how they tend to start out as being kind of open and participatory, and there's big feeling around their transformative power. And then, sooner or later, they're kind of taken over by corporate interests. And then there's another one that comes along behind it that is the next band of rebels that want to be, power to the people and be transparent and rebel against the corporate takeover. And whether it's from telegraphy to telephony to radio to television, that book, he just documents how it's just this cycle that repeats very predictably, like through every communications technology. And I think the way that he frames that up is a great way of thinking about it. So if that's true, then it might be that there's another big, information communications kind of technology in our future. It's hard with the degree of kind of lock-in that's happened now to imagine that still happening. But if history really does repeat itself, then when the internet finally gets so bogged down and so kind of taken over and so paralyzed, when it's made so difficult, like when you can't even upload a video to YouTube because you didn't even realize there's a radio playing in the background, and then your video gets taken down for a copyright. Like when even an honest, like trying hard effort just gets rejected out of hand by some automated copyright, robot, then it's getting to be time to maybe go create something else and start over. And Tim would say that's what we should expect, because that's how these patterns play out.
So are you positive about or what has changed in your thinking from then to now in terms of the internet or the web, so to speak?
Well, I guess my thinking has changed only in as much that the internet is super powerful, right? I mean, it's this incredible possibility that we talked about. And because it is still to some degree really open and participatory, I mean, if you can code HTML and you can $4 to $5 a month shared hosting account somewhere, then there's a lot that you can do, right? Mm-hmm. And you can grow from there. AWS and all the other kind of services that make it possible to scale and do crazy things. The whole Google Office infrastructure, like just the way that you can turn on all the technology that you need to run a good-sized company in under a month, and single-digit thousands of dollars, where a decade ago it was 100 times more expensive to do, like what you can just do in a month with a couple grand today. But there, basically anything is possible, and because anything is possible, and because people have a wide range of motivations and intentions and desires, they're all going to go find ways to do those things that they want to do, because really anything is possible. I don't think you can create a tool of any power that only has upside. And I think however far out to the good, in the good dimension that upside can be, there's always going to be parallel kind of power for, mayhem and madness on the other side. So I just don't know how you create a tool that people can't use both ways. And the more powerful it is, then the more awesome the things they can do, and the more stupid and ridiculous things they can do. So I think how my thinking has changed is just watching that happen and coming to acknowledge that that's the price of having a really powerful tool, is people are going to do things with it.
Cool. Chris, I think, wants to take us in some other direction. So cool.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about open educational resources for a bit. And it's easy to see what the strengths of openness are. But I would also like to talk about whether there are limits to openness and what those limits are. So as a way to begin, there's a lot of educational resources that are learning by assimilation. MOOCs, textbooks, a lot of the open stuff is a cheaper way to learn by assimilation, but it's still learning by assimilation. And there are, of course, also opportunities for openness with learning by doing. And in fact, the curricula that my colleagues and I have built with NSF funding have all been released by Harvard under a license where any teacher can come and download it and use it for free. Mm-hmm. But it's not fire and forget the way that a textbook is, or even a MOOC is. There's substantial upkeep costs that either somebody funds out of the goodness of their heart, or eventually it stops working. Mm-hmm. And I also wonder if there are differences in quality in openness across different fields. Is it easier to keep some materials really good and really current than other materials in a field that might, for example, be shifting very rapidly, or a field where there's a lot of controversy about what should be taught? So I'd love to hear your thoughts about whether there are limits to openness, and what are some of the places where you think openness has weaknesses or could be improved.
Yeah, I think you're playing the greatest hits there, kind of, when you start to think about what the weaknesses of open are. And it almost comes back to what we were just talking about the power of the internet. That you can't come up with anything that can only be universally good. There's always going to be these equal downsides to it. And so when you think about open and the idea that that OER are going to be created in this community-based format, it's going to be super participatory, or maybe my local college is going to have an OER grant program and they're going to award $2,500 to somebody who wants to create an open textbook or some other collection of materials that could be used to replace whatever they're teaching with before. It's at least in our community, it's a bit of a famous saying to say that faculty, the overwhelming majority of faculty, have never had a single class on how to teach. Right? They may have been lured by free food to an occasional hour-long lunch workshop that related to pedagogy, but it's And that's absolutely true. And even fewer of them have ever been trained in instructional design or to know the learning science or any of the things that you would need to know to create effective learning materials. So on the one hand, there's all this kind of power and democratic participation, and everybody's involved, and colleges are giving grants to professors of sociology or whatever to write new materials. All these materials are being created, and they're being created by people who, in the overwhelming majority of cases, have never had a single course on how to teach or on how to design effective instructional materials. So what are the implications of that? The implications of that are that you end up with OER that look like the OER that are available today, largely, right? So I think issues of, I think there is this tension between wanting to be open and participatory and democratic, but also wanting to create materials that aren't just going to be, a long list of facts connected together in something like a coherent narrative, as opposed to something that would actually engage you in learning by doing, that might get you engaged in some practice, that might be giving you immediate feedback. Maybe that feedback might even be tailored to a misunderstanding that you've demonstrated as you were engaged in the practice. There's no reason you couldn't create material like that and openly license it. Lumen does it, you do it, there are people who do it, but if you don't know the learning science, it's like getting everybody in town together and say, hey, you guys, we've all driven across bridges all of our life. We know how bridges work. We'd like to give out some $2,500 grants for people to design bridges. But you all know how they work. You've been part of them your whole life. It's slightly more complicated than that. So I think there's two sides to the kind of. I think there's two sides to that, to the participatory nature of OER. Sustainability, the one that you just hit on, a huge problem for the open education movement is it's just absolute allergy to talking about money, right? Either things have to be grant funded, either money has to be given to me for free, or we just need to shut everything down and stop. The idea that we would ever develop a model where there was revenue, the R word, say it very softly, the idea that there would ever be some kind of inflow of money that would continue to support that work over time, at some point became anathema to what a lot of people in the open movement think of as openness. That it either has to be grant funded or it all has to be volunteer work. And the idea that you could build a model with some revenue associated with it so that the work could last more than 24 months or 48 months or however long your grant is going to last. Man, the open community's just got to get over that. Or it's just going to be this scattered trail of projects that live for 2 or 4 years and then die by the wayside, and it's just a train of bodies, So sustainability is a problem. I'm trying to remember the other things you said, Chris, but all the things you were hitting on, you were right on with some of the things you were saying about weaknesses and problems with the way the open movement is kind of framed up right now.
I know when we were in Arizona, David, a year and a half ago for the Open Ed conference, that was the big issue. And that's partly why you stepped down, and it kind of fractured it into two camps. And I don't know where it is at now and which camp has taken over. I don't know if you even want to speak to that, but I'm curious, given Chris's question, if you could highlight or provide us a couple of places that we might go to for examples that have utilized open educational resources or other aspects of open learning in a more constructivistic, participatory, contributory way. We've all seen the $2,500 grants that our universities are giving out to use an open textbook or create an open textbook or whatever. Have you seen anything that's more wiki-like contributory that you might speak to?
Probably, if I think about it for a skosh. Well, so one of the things that we've been doing at Lumen for the last about year now is one of the great things about using openly licensed material is that you don't have to worry about digital rights management. You don't have to worry about paywalls and passwords and things like that. You can just take the content and you can put it out publicly for everybody to see it and access it. And all of the content that we work with is all open. And we went through a couple of cycles of trying to figure out how to make it easier for people to participate, not in the creation of materials, but in the continuous improvement of materials. I think there's a big difference between that first blueprinting, planning, identifying learning outcomes, alignment, all the kinds of things that goes on at the beginning of that process. That requires one kind of expertise, and continuous improvement. I think it's possible to participate in continuous improvement without maybe as much kind of intellectual overhead as there is in the original kind of design process. But we've been trying to look for ways to get the community involved in continuous improvement. We've been doing some data-driven continuous improvement that has been super interesting that we can talk about if we get there. But we finally struck on a model that worked for getting particularly students involved in the process of contributing to the improvement of materials. And this is how it works. Essentially, at the bottom of every page, and the page might be a page of interactives or practice exercises or videos or text or some combination of that, whatever's on the page, at the bottom of the page, there's a single statement that says, do you have an idea about how to make this better? And a button that says, like, improve this page. And if you click that button, it doesn't turn the page into a wiki, but instead all of the content on that page has already been copied over into a public-facing Google Doc. Okay. And so when I click that button, it sends me over to the Google Doc and it lands me there with track changes turned on. And then anything that I think ought to be improved, instead of trying to file a ticket or do something like that, I just start typing in the same content I was reading, and it comes out, green and underlined with a bubble out on the right that attributes, who's making it. And so you can go from having an idea about how that content might be better to having made that suggestion in 60 seconds, right? And then we have a process on the back end that takes every one of those suggestions, turns it into a ticket in our tracking system. They all get triaged by a human being and then sorted out for, if this is a typo, this kind of person can fix it. If this is an argument about how this term ought to be defined, then that can go to a subject matter expert, and a process for pulling that together. But it's been really interesting just providing this little opportunity, and over 99% of it is students who are contributing, providing this little opportunity for people to contribute. We're doing a couple of hundred contributions a week, of people making suggestions about, this wasn't clear to me, it would have been better if you'd explained it this way, something along those lines. And the amount of graffiti is very low. It's just been super interesting to watch. And part of how we got to that model was looking, there's a terrific little book. Let me see if I can put my hand on it real fast. I don't know if you know this book, Internet Success.
Who's it by?
Schweik and English are the authors. The title is Internet Success, A Study of Open Source Software Commons. And basically they've gone through and done an empirical analysis of open source code repositories and looked to see what are the characteristics of open source software projects that are able to attract contributors as opposed to those that never attract any contributors. And they kind of provide some lessons learned about, if you actually want people to contribute to the work you're doing, what do you need to do to help make that happen? And it shouldn't be any surprise to anyone to hear that the longer it takes to make a contribution, the fewer people will make a contribution, because you're not paying them, like if it takes half an hour to get in and dig around and learn the technology and something else, then nobody's going to contribute. But And we saw that through a couple of earlier iterations. But this model that we've hit on now, you're reading down a page, you're like, oh, that's dreadful. I could do this better. Or I just watched a video, a YouTube video that would be great right here. Any suggestion you want to make, you just click the button, you put your cursor right where it should go, you type your suggestion, and then you leave. It's literally less than a minute. And so now there are hundreds of people that are contributing that way. And then we've created a new section in the front matter of all of the courseware, an acknowledgement section, that no matter how small your suggestion was, if your suggestion was, hey, at the end of this sentence there were 2 periods, there only should have been 1, your name goes in the acknowledgement section of the text. So now, like, the Intro to Psych book has 100 names in the acknowledgement section, and like 98 of them are students who made, these contributions. So that's been pretty exciting, but you'll notice that it's not just kind of turning everybody loose in a wiki to directly change the canonical page that everyone is looking at and using, right? It's making it super easy for everybody to contribute, and then having a process for that to run through so that it can be seen by a subject matter expert or whoever needs to look at it, depending on what kind of change it is. It can very quickly be incorporated, and then you can be acknowledged, and it's really been exciting.
I had a student do a dissertation related to that, looking at what motivates people to join the user groups within Adobe and other companies like Google, and provide free knowledge and expertise and handle the problems that people have without being paid a cent.
Right.
And maybe get the company picnic and get some award and whatnot. In the YouTube channel, Dante is asking if you could share a couple of stories. She's also asking if this has changed your perspective on educational philosophy and educational practices as a whole. I wonder if in sharing a couple stories about open education movement, if you could share the one about the certificate that's in the article that we wrote, because that's really seminal. In some ways, it was the proto-MOOC. It led to MOOCs. And so people might not be aware that you were the precursor to the MOOC movement.
Yeah, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know.
I don't know.
But yeah, so, back in the kind of mid-aughts, when I was still full-time faculty, I was every semester trying to fiddle with my course design to figure out how to make it more open. Starting out with things like just making sure that all the readings were accessible to anyone who wanted to read them. You didn't have to have a login to the library. Putting the syllabus in a wiki and then telling all the students, look, the syllabus is in a wiki. You can change the syllabus if you want. Begging anyone, please, to change it's your course. Please change anything in the syllabus, and not being able to get anybody to engage. There for about, I think it was the 3rd semester finally, when someone finally edited the syllabus. And what would you guess they did when they edited the syllabus finally? They added assignments to the course. That was the.
Exactly. I was just going to say that.
More work.
Yeah, exactly. So this was part of this kind of ongoing experiment. So in the fall, I think it was of 2007, I realized that at this point, the syllabus was online, all the readings were online. For a couple of years, I'd had my students doing their writing on blogs, and you submitted your homework by publishing your article to the blog, so I could read it, everyone else in the class could read it, anybody in the world could read it. I just realized one day, this whole class is already happening on the internet anyway. Anybody could play the home version of this class, and there was nobody else teaching. This was Introduction to Open Education, and it wasn't being taught anywhere else in the world yet. And so I just put out a thing on a listserv and said, hey, here's this class. You can come see the syllabus and all the readings and the assignments. And here's how you publish them and how things work. And anybody who comes and plays along, you're not going to get credit from Utah State, but me, David Wiley, the individual human being, I'll be happy to write a certificate for you that says, congratulations, Kurt Bonk, you completed this course that I taught. And it will mean nothing as far as any other university is concerned, but you can hang it on your wall or start a small fire with it, or whatever feels appropriate to you. And so what would have been a graduate seminar, I think we had 6 or 7 people from Utah State in that course, and we had over 70 in the course overall from all over the world. who came and just kind of played along, read the readings, wrote the blogs, participated in the discussion. This is pre-Zoom, so this is all asynchronously happening. So that was all super fun, and I did award some certificates at the end of that to people. And I did, at one point, have a very interesting, and I say this in the Japanese sense of the word interesting, conversation with my provost about the degree to which it was appropriate for me to be issuing certificates for people who were participating in a class. So
I was just going to ask you about, because it made the Chronicle of Higher Ed, if I'm not mistaken. It said,
yeah, I think Jeff wrote about it. Yeah.
Got you in a little bit of trouble, maybe.
Well, once I reassured him that, there was no university logo on it anywhere, there's no university name on it anywhere. It just said, I, David Wiley, whoever I am, hereby, certify that you finished this course that I was teaching. And it didn't have the university name or course number or anything like that on it. And that was good enough. That didn't make anybody happy, but that was good enough for me to, not get into real trouble.
Do you have a follow-up, a second story for Dante? She asked for 2 stories. Is there another one you want to share with us?
Oh, remind me the context again. What kind of story is she asking for?
Open education movement story.
Oh, good gracious.
I remember back in 2004 where you had all those cards where people had your team had different names attached to them. And one was the Maverick and all that.
Oh, yeah, that's a really fun story. It doesn't relate to anything here, though. But, the research center I was running at Utah State, which was the Center for Open and Sustainable Learning, I don't know, we were 10 full-time, 10, graduate student assistant kind of grant-funded center. And we got the idea one year that for business cards, we should do baseball cards. Like they should all have your picture on the front and a logo. And we made it, we made jerseys, and then everybody made up ridiculous statistics to go on the back. And that was kind of fun. So then next year we did like superhero cards, and we all made up fake superhero names, and we had superpowers and weaknesses and things like that. But the thing that was really interesting, and I mean, the reason I was willing to kind of spend overhead money on it was that taking my students to conferences like to AECT and places like that, we put on all the cards like, 7 of 19. And so there's just a thing in people that when you see that 7 of 19, you're like, wait, there's 18 more of these I could have. And then, people started searching out my students and asking around, like, do you have one of those cards? And it was just a great way of getting the people I was working with at the center networked in some of these events where a lot of us would go together, both because the cards were different from a normal business card, but also that kind of teaser of 11 of 18 or whatever it was. Then it makes you want to start collecting, right?
But it wasn't just networking. It was trying to get other universities to adopt open education. You're trying to build a network with different marketing tools.
Yeah, but if you say that out loud, you can't say it out loud, Kurt. That's the part you have to keep quiet. If they realize what you're doing, then it won't work. Yeah.
And it did work.
So,
Chris?
Go ahead, Chris.
I keep thinking about how to stop people from generating $2,500 worth of stuff, but that nobody but them is going to use. And in fact, they probably would have been better off taking somebody else's $2,500 thing and just using that, because they may not have known anything about design. Now, one of the things that we know that people resonate to is a leaderboard. If you have something like a leaderboard, competitive people at least get really interested in trying to carve out a space for themselves on a leaderboard. And I can imagine setting up kind of a set of parameters. Let's just pick something arbitrary. Let's pick a chapter on Montessori that would be in a book about approaches to teaching and learning, OER. So there would be certain specifications to get even above threshold. You'd have to be able, a typical person would have to be able to read it in less than 15 minutes. The vocabulary would have to be at let's say a 10th grade level. It would need a certain density of illustrations. It would need a certain density of evidence-based citations, whatever we might specify. Questions at the end that are evocative of helping you think about the big ideas in the chapter. And then, there's an initial group of people that compete, and something's put up on the leaderboard. And you say, okay, if you got a $2,500 grant and you want to be the new leader, that's great. We're happy to curate this. But here's the rules. And you should look at what is on the leaderboard and estimate whether you think you can do better before you spend the money and time. Now, is that just really naive, or could something like that actually work?
I think something like that can actually work, and let me tell you about where that's something we're actively trying to do. Let me tell you about where we are kind of in our journey toward that. So we have a particular approach to continuous improvement that we call RISE, which stands for Resource Inspection, Selection, and Evaluation. And basically, RISE is an algorithm that will run through the data generated by learners going through a course, and will identify if a course has 250 kind of individual learning outcomes in it. RISE will pick out of all those outcomes and rank order those outcomes in which students invested the most effort with the aligned learning content, the practice exercises, the video, where they spent the most time and the most effort, and they performed the worst on the aligned assessments. So a place where they're doing everything we ask them to in terms of engaging with the materials, but they're still not able to demonstrate mastery. So we produce what I lovingly refer to as the loser board, as opposed to the leaderboard. It's the 10 outcomes taught by, say, in our Introduction to Sociology courseware. It's the 10 outcomes that need the most help, okay? And so we publish this openly at the end of every semester. We run that analysis over all of our courses, and we publish it on our website. And that was phase one, is getting to a point where we could say, here's the loser board. And now, what does phase two look like? So I have this kind of motto of beat control, which is kind of what you were saying, right? Like, can we beat the control, right? Here's how it's doing now. Can we possibly do any better? We're this summer, actually earlier this week, we signed a contract with a company that provides the kinds of tools to do A/B testing in different content platforms, right? Now, they normally work with e-commerce companies where you're testing different positions of buttons or different headlines or different calls to actions, trying to maximize the amount of money that people spend on your e-commerce website, right? But we have a hypothesis that if you take that amount of money that people spend on a website, if you pull that metric out and you put in another metric, which is the score on the final summative assessment, that's still a numeric metric, and you can take that whole tool chain of A/B testing and funnel analysis and everything else, and you can use that to optimize that number and try to drive that number higher. So as soon as we have this all kind of set up and turned on, and I've talked about this at conferences before, back when we had conferences, that tells you how long we've been working on this. The vision is, that people would come in, they'd look at the loser board, they'd say, oh my gosh, really? People are struggling with that concept? I do that way better in my class. Let me contribute a video, an interactive. There's no parameters we're going to put on it because we don't care. If you have something that we can empirically demonstrate will support better student outcomes than what's already in there, that's really what we want to know. So people would be able to submit these swap outs of materials for what's currently there in support of that learning outcome, and then we just A/B test it. We got thousands of students in each of our courses. You split test that across 2,000 students or 10,000 students in each condition. You find out if it beats control or not. If it does, it stays in the course, and it's the new approach to it's the new approach to how we teach that topic in Intro to Soc. And next semester, somebody else might be able to come along and beat it, right? The thing that is really interesting to me is to be able to give then reporting back to you, Chris, to say, you contributed this piece, a year and a half ago. And since you contributed it, it's been used by 13,000 this many students, and it improved their learning of this topic by 0.38 standard deviations. And I can give you that report term after term, how many students it's impacted, how much it's impacted them, and then you can figure out how to convince your provost that they should care about the fact that the work you're doing is impacting real students and actually improving their learning. I can't help you argue with your provost, but I can give you some pretty interesting metrics around the impact that you're having, and it kind of turns all of the courseware into just kind of a giant competition around who can come up with the best approach. And it's not an argument. It's not about theories like we only allow constructivist approaches or we only take behavior. Like, I don't care. If we can plug it in and it can beat control, it stays in. If you've got a better one, put your money where your mouth is. Design a better one. We'll plug it in, A/B test it. If it beats control, it stays in, right? So did any of you guys know Philip Dodds?
Yes, I've met Philip because I was part of the Army Research Institute
From ADL?
research fellow. Yeah. He came to the meetings. Yeah.
Philip Dodds would always say, running code trumps all theory. And I really loved that about that. Like, we'd be sitting around arguing for hours and hours. He'd be like, guys, implement it. Let's see if it works, right? It's like, the story about Francis Bacon, the kind of birth of empiricism, when he's in a pub and he's hearing these people argue over the number of teeth in a horse's mouth, and he just grabs them both by the ears and drags them outside and opens the horse's mouth and sticks their head like, look, this is an empirical question. We can answer this by reference to the world. Like, just count the teeth instead of sitting in here and arguing about it. So instead of having, these ongoing battles about philosophy of this or this theoretical framework or whatever, like, implement it. We'll put it in, we'll A/B test it. If it beats control, it stays. It simplifies things in a lot of ways.
Well, Punya has a follow-up for you, but before we do, Phil Dodds, if you all know Phil Dodds, because he was the guy interacting with the alien ship in Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
He played the organ.
He played the organ, back and forth. And Steven Spielberg saw him as the sound man hanging around on the set, and he said, "Can you act?" And he said, "Well, I've never acted." He sent him to acting school to get in that. Just that was his one appearance in Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
He built that synthesizer. That's why he was there. He built the synthesizer that was used in the movie, and then ended up playing it. Yeah, it's crazy.
Very cool guy. Very crazy story.
Yeah.
All the audience should look this or just watch Close Encounters of the Third Kind again. It's fabulous. Punya.
Yeah, so this is going to be a slight shift as my comment here, as you might have seen. You've managed to straddle sort of academia, the corporate world, and I'm wondering what works in which space and how do you navigate? What I think that's just an interesting sort of manner in which you have managed to sort of do that in different ways. So I was just curious about the nature of each of those.
Sure. Well, it starts with being comfortable being hated by everybody. If you're an academic, then business people look at you and think you're just impossibly naive and so disconnected from reality that you just don't. And if you're an academic, you look at business people and you think you're a money-grubbing, greedy, you don't care about human beings. And you can be in one camp and at least you're only hated by half of them, right? But if you put a foot in both camps, you get to be hated by everybody. So first, you kind of have to be comfortable with that because not all, some of your former academic colleagues will just think you're a giant sellout and like, what are you doing? Because you could be writing articles, which is the highest possible calling that a person can have. And your business people, you're constantly trying to establish credibility with people in the business world because they know you come from academia and they've met other academics before and they just immediately assume that you know nothing, that you're not cut out to be here. So it really It starts with you have to be so interested in getting the work done that you don't care, right, about how people look at you. And I've not always been successful at the not caring part. And honestly, it's been really, really hard sometimes. But, the work is the work. And so you put the work first.
It's funny because without going into too many details, going through the exact same thing right now with some work that we're doing, and the miscommunication that happens because of perceptions of, rather than, so it's just, and I completely hear you, and I completely get that part about that, even though it's not personal and the work is more important, how much it can sap in some ways. So, Yeah, so thank you for sharing that, because I think, there are very few people who manage to do that and do that well. So, I was just really curious about that.
Well, I would say it's important to have a yin to go with your yang, right? So I have a co-founder and partner whose name's Kim Thanos. She has an MBA. She's done a couple of startups before. Great, super smart on the business side of things, and genuinely interested in education, and has great instincts on the education side, but her training and her prior experience was on business. Well, my training, prior experience is all in academia, but I'm interested in the business side of things, and it turns out my instincts aren't terrible on the business side of things either. And you put the two of us together and lock us in a room for 8 years. We founded Lumen in October of 2012, so almost 9 years now. And, between the two of us, like when there's something on the business side that I still don't know exactly what's going on, Kim is right there. Same thing, the other way with something academic. And I've learned so much from her during this period of time. And I think she would say that she's learned a lot from me too. So having good partners makes a ton of difference as well.
Well, that's why we brought you in here, to give you a mental hug, because we respect what you've been doing. And you start talking about the research side of things, and people might not know that you're heavily involved in the research side on open textbooks. And you have another partner in that regard named John Hilton, who's, the two of you have done a series of studies about open textbooks. You want to just brief, because we don't have a boatload of time, but kind of sketch out a little bit about what you've studied and what you found.
Yeah, well, really you can summarize all of that research by saying that you can save students a lot of money without doing them any harm academically. Now, why that is true is a really interesting question. On the one hand, we all know the pile of literature in which there's, where people go out to try their new framework, their new pedagogy, their new tool that they've developed, whatever, and they come out with no significant difference. It turns out, I would say that a lot of the early OER research basically couldn't lose, because you knew students were going to save money, and there's a 99% chance there's going to be no difference in outcomes, because there's never any difference. There's hardly ever any difference in outcomes, right? And you're saving them a ton of money, so you can just do study after study after study in forestry, in psychology, in this discipline, and that. Look, we saved them a ton of money, and everybody got the same scores on the final exam they always got before. And I would say that there's the first decade of empirical research in OER is all about that. It all boils down to, look, we saved a lot of money and we didn't hurt learning outcomes. And to Chris's point a while ago, that's generally true because the commercial textbook that the open textbook was pushing out wasn't great either, right? It was a bigger collection of text and images and problems with odd numbered answers in the back, or whatever, however it was formatted. And you look at someone like OpenStax, who has said, our goal is to look as much like a traditional textbook as we possibly can and just be free. Because then When I'm a faculty member, I'm like, oh, I can't adopt this weird open, like, I don't even know what you're talking about. That sounds too different. That's a step too far for me to take. They can say, no, look, it literally looks exactly like the thing you're using now. It just has an open license and it's free. So there was, we kind of had a joke that there were 3 outcomes and 2 ways to win, right? Students could learn more and they could save money. They could learn the same amount and they could save money, or they could learn less and save money. So you want to watch out for that one. But the odds of either of those 2 things happening, given the history of educational research, are so low that you could be pretty confident that you could do almost anything, save them a lot of money, and not hurt outcomes. And I would say that the current state of a lot of the research on OER is still kind of stuck in that space, right?
So I'm gonna cut you off, David. Sorry about
Please.
that, but Chris has a question, and I have a follow-up before we end. We only have a few minutes left. So, Chris.
Great.
Well, I think I have a fairly quick question. So many of the people who view this program in its archives particularly are from global South countries.
Mm-hmm.
And they might be saying, these Western textbooks, and for that matter, this Western OER just isn't a good fit for us. It's the wrong language, it's the wrong cultural spin. We really would like to produce our own OER that's appropriate for us. Do you have advice that you would give a group that was going to undertake that?
Yeah, I think the group specifically that you're talking about, I think the advice that I would give is, UNESCO recently made a formal recommendation about OER adoption and creation and use to all of its member states. There are some, as a side issue, there are some technical problems with the definition of OER in the UNESCO recommendation. But broadly, to be able to go into your Ministry of Education in Nepal and say, hey, look, UNESCO is talking about this thing and it's important, and maybe we could collaborate with some other people in the region, or maybe we could do a small pilot. But it's not just you, random person, walking off the street saying, I think this is a good idea. You can walk in with a formal UNESCO recommendation and say, we should at least try this because they're having success with it in other places. Kurt, you had one more too, I think you said?
Yeah, I'm trying to unmute my mic. You know how it goes. David, you've been in so many different prongs related to open education. Is there a particular prong that you haven't explored that's next on your list to do? What do you see yourself doing in a couple of years or in the near future? And as part of that, as we reopen schools, is there some aspect of what you've been working on that you would like to see schools adopt related to the open education movement that they haven't been successful in doing before? And the same is true of universities. Is there something that you would like to see in the next couple of years as we reopen and still embrace or start to embrace the open ed movement, and maybe in a different way? What things would you personally, and would you like to see schools or universities embrace?
Well, for me personally, I would say a lot of it is wrapped up in continuous improvement, right? How to create these cycles of feedback coming back from learners, coming back from faculty, so that one of the defining characteristics of OER is that you have permission to make any kind of change to it you could possibly want, right? The problem with that is that you likely have no idea what actually needs to be changed or how you could benefit students. It's really easy to make changes. It's really hard to make improvements, right? So pairing learning analytics together with OER gives you permission to make changes, right? OER gives you permission to make changes, but don't tell you what to change. Learning analytics can tell you where students are working really hard but still struggling, but they can't give you permission to do anything about it. When you put that chocolate in that peanut butter, then it seems like that's where the real magic is going to happen, right? Because to the conversation Chris and I were having earlier, if you don't have any training about how to create effective learning materials, that carries over into changes that you might make to learning materials as well. You can go in there and change all kinds of stuff. You can spend your whole Christmas holiday changing things up before the next semester starts and likely not change outcomes for your students at all, right? So this bringing together of just a mindset of empiricism around combining that with the ability to make changes and improvements to OER, I think is probably the single most exciting part of all of it, because otherwise it's just all of us just kind of firing off in the dark saying, oh, I have a hunch from 3 months ago. I kind of remember it seemed like somebody didn't understand that. Maybe I'll spend some time making changes there. You can just go outside and look in the horse's mouth at this point, right? Because this is all happening online. We're capturing those data. You can bring them together with OER.
David, I want to thank you for an interesting show, an interesting hour, a great time, and there's going to be a lot of follow-up. For people who want to catch up with David, he's going to be president of AERA in a couple of years. He's president
No.
AECT.
I'm sorry,
Oh,
AECT.
brother.
I say
Hold
AERA.
on. No. I would not say yes to that one.
So he'll be president of ACT in the not too distant future, and he'll have many new plans. Young is going to introduce the next show.
All right, thanks, David. That's wonderful. Next show is kind of related, but in a different angle. So we have not really dealt a lot with special education. So next week, we're inviting two professors. One is James Basham from University of Kansas and Trey Vasquez from University of Central Florida, two really leading figures in using technology in special education. But another reason we want to invite them is because they have been recently awarded to lead the National Center for Using Technology in Special Education, which is supposed to promote technology uses and support teachers in special education. So they're supposed to build a national network to drive the use of technology, to make it better, make it more. So we want to have a discussion about how do we build open resources, like David is talking about. You know, this show, Silver Lining for Learning, has had a lot of conversation about what has people been doing. This one will talk about what did they do, but really, what can we build and how we can help. I really love to say, how can we build something? I welcome everybody to give suggestions. This is going to be fun. Thank you so much. I hope to see you next week.